On a quiet day in May 1999, the small, unassuming town of Snowtown, South Australia, became the epicenter of one of the most gruesome discoveries in the nation's history. Snowtown, a place where nothing much ever happened. The locals led simple lives, and the town's name had rarely been mentioned beyond its borders. But that would change forever. Snowtown would soon be known for something darker, something far more sinister. Inside a disused bank building, its decaying exterior giving no hint of the horrors hidden within, police made a discovery that would shake Australia to its core. As they entered the building, the air thickened with the smell of decay, a smell that made the officers stop in their tracks. Inside the vault they found 6 barrels, each filled with a foul, murky liquid, and within that liquid were the dismembered bodies of multiple victims. This was no ordinary crime. This was the result of something born from the darkest, most twisted corners of the human mind. The media would later call it the bodies in the barrels murders, but the full extent of the horror would take years to unravel. It all began with one man, John Bunting, the ringleader, the orchestrator of a killing spree that would claim the lives of at least 12 people. Bunting was filled with hate, driven by a sick desire to rid the world of those he saw as weak, vulnerable, corrupt. He found others who shared in his depravity. Robert Wagner, his loyal accomplice, and James Vlasakis, a troubled young man pulled into Bunting's web of violence. Together they embarked on a killing spree that would span years. They targeted the most vulnerable, people from their own community. Some were friends, others simply neighbors, but all were marked for death by Bunting's sadistic hand, their method of disposing of the body's dismemberment. The victims were cut into pieces, stuffed into barrels, filled with acid, the bodies slowly dissolving into a macabre chemical soup. Imagine the silence of that vault, the weight of the door as it creaked open, the smell seeping into the open air. Officers standing there, stunned, barely able to comprehend what they were seeing. As they peered inside, they found the remains of human bodies, liquefying, floating in the acid, flesh clinging to the edges of the barrels. But these bodies in Snowtown were just the beginning. John Bunting's reign of terror had spread far beyond this small town. He wasn't content with just killing. He had taken their lives and then their identities, claiming their welfare benefits long after they were dead. He didn't just want them gone. He wanted to erase their very existence. The victims were tortured before they died, their bodies hidden away, left to decay in the barrels. The house of horrors they created was not just a place of death. It was a place of evil. Each murder, each victim, only fueled the killer's desire for more. Bunting's followers, they were equally twisted. Robert Wagner was his right hand, laughing as he helped Bunting strangle a victim, their life draining beneath their hands. And James Vlasakis, young, impressionable, manipulated into the darkness. He claimed Bunting had such control over him, he couldn't say no. He, too, had blood on his hands. The media descended on Snowtown. The world learned of the horrors. This quiet town was now synonymous with death and mutilation. The case captivated the nation, each revelation more horrific than the last. In the trial that followed, John Bunting and Robert Wagner were sentenced to life in prison without parole. Vlasakis turned on his accomplices, providing evidence, earning a reduced sentence, though he too was forever stained by the blood of the innocent. To this day, the vault in Snowtown stands, a grim reminder of the evil that once lurked within. The town tries to move on, but the scars run deep. The bodies may be buried, but the horror of what happened remains. The barrels once filled with acid and human remains have long been emptied, but for those who know the story, Snowtown will forever be a place where death came, quietly, slowly, in the darkest corners of human nature. The bodies in the barrels murders will always be a chilling reminder that true evil can hide behind the most ordinary of facades. And sometimes the quietest places hold the darkest secrets. So the next time you pass through a quiet, unassuming town, remember this: the most terrifying horrors are often hidden in plain sight. In the shadowy corners of Melbourne, a city known for its vibrant culture and lively streets, there lurks a tale so dark, so terrifying, that it echoes through the narrow alleys and hidden pathways like a whispered warning, a tale of bloodshed, and a man whose name still strikes fear into the hearts of those who remember him. They called him the Melbourne Ripper. The year was 1949, and post-war Melbourne was trying to rebuild itself. People were finding normalcy again, but beneath the surface something evil stirred. A predator roamed the streets, stalking his victims with cold, calculating precision. It began on a cold June night. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. A woman named Ivy McLeod, a young and beautiful woman, was walking home. She had no idea that something was watching her. No idea that this would be her final night alive. She never made it home. Her body was found the next morning, mutilated, butchered. The crime scene was horrific. Her throat had been slashed, her body stabbed over and over in a frenzied attack. The brutality was something the police had never seen before. It wasn't just a murder, it was an act of rage, of madness. The city was stunned. People were afraid to walk the streets at night, but the fear was only beginning. Just weeks later, another woman was found dead. Her name was Joyce Thomas. Her body was discovered in a dark alley, just like Ivy's, mutilated in the same horrific manner. Her throat slashed, her body punctured by countless stab wounds. The killer had struck again. Melbourne was in the grip of terror. The newspapers began calling the killer the Melbourne Ripper, and the city descended into panic. People whispered in fear. Who was this monster? Who would be next? But the Ripper wasn't finished. His bloodlust was growing. Weeks passed, and the city held its breath, hoping, praying, that the killing spree would end. But the Melbourne Ripper was far from done. His next victim was a woman named Pauline Thompson. Her body was found behind a row of shops, her lifeless form twisted in a grotesque display of violence. The wounds were the same, deep, vicious cuts, like a signature marking her death as his. But this time, the police found something more. Near her body, there was a clue, a single strand of hair clutched in her hand. It was the first break in the case, but would it be enough to stop him? The city had become a hunting ground for the Ripper, each murder more savage than the last, each attack more daring. The streets became empty at night, the air thick with the sense that something was watching, something was waiting. For a while it seemed the Ripper had vanished, like a ghost slipping back into the shadows. But then, the killings resumed. His final victim was Betty Gardner, a young woman walking alone after a night out with friends. She was found in a park, her throat cut, her body riddled with stab wounds, the same savage pattern, the same ruthless brutality. But this time, the police were ready. Through relentless investigation, they were led to a man named Stanley Taylor, a drifter with a history of violence and a darkness in his eyes that sent chills down the spine of even the most hardened officers. Taylor was arrested, his calm demeanor unsettling as he faced the accusations. He denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. The hair found in Pauline Thompson's hand matched his past of violent outbursts, his proximity to each crime scene, all pointed to him, and yet Taylor showed no remorse, no fear. In the courtroom, as the details of his gruesome acts were laid bare, he sat there emotionless, like a man who knew the darkness inside him had already consumed him. He was found guilty, sentenced to hang for his crimes. But even as the noose tightened around his neck, he said nothing. No confession, no apology, just silence. The Ripper's reign of terror was over, but the fear, the horror he left behind, lingered. Melbourne never forgot. Even now, if you walk those same streets, down those same dark alleys where the Ripper hunted, you can feel it. The weight of the past, the ghosts of those who died so violently, their presence, always there, as if they're waiting for someone to remember their names, to speak of their suffering. But the Melbourne Ripper, he remains a figure of pure, cold evil. He didn't just kill. He fed on fear. He thrived on the terror he spread. His name is still whispered in fear. So, when you find yourself walking the streets of Melbourne at night, take a moment to look over your shoulder, watch the shadows closely, and remember, the Ripper once walked here, and some say the darkness he carried with him never truly left. In a quiet town in Aberdeen, New South Wales, on February 29th, 2000, a night of horror was about to unfold. John Price, a 44-year-old father of three, had been in an on-again, off-again relationship with Catherine Knight for several years. Their relationship was turbulent, full of violent arguments and explosive fights, but no one, least of all John, could have predicted the monstrous act that Catherine was about to commit. Catherine Knight was no stranger to violence. Her life had been shaped by it, starting from her early years when she was abused by her own family. This trauma manifested in her adult life through a string of failed relationships, all marked by domestic violence and abuse, but no one expected her rage to escalate to the horrifying level it did on that cold February night. John Price had seen the warning signs. He knew that Catherine was dangerous. He had even filed for a restraining order earlier that month, telling friends that if anything ever happened to him, they should look to Catherine. But despite his own fears, John allowed Catherine back into his home one final time. That evening, after another heated argument, John Price went to bed, unaware that his life was about to be brutally cut short. As he slept, Catherine Knight quietly retrieved a butcher's knife from the kitchen. She crept into the bedroom, the cold steel gleaming in her hand, and without hesitation, she stabbed him. Not once, not twice. She didn't stop. Catherine stabbed John Price 37 times. Each plunge of the knife with such force that it tore through vital organs and even bones. Blood splattered across the room. But Catherine Knight wasn't finished. In one of the most horrific acts of mutilation in Australian history, Catherine Knight skinned John Price's entire body. With the precision of a butcher, her former occupation, she peeled away his flesh, then hung it from a meat hook in the doorway, like a grotesque trophy of her rage. But that wasn't the worst of it. Catherine then decapitated John. She placed his severed head in a pot on the stove. She cooked parts of his body, including his buttocks, serving them up with vegetables. She set the table with plates of human flesh, intending them for John's children when they returned home. Next to the plates, she left chilling, handwritten notes, as if she were preparing a twisted family meal. Fortunately, John's children never arrived. The next morning, when John Price didn't show up for work, his worried co-workers called the police. Officers arrived at his house, unaware of the horror that awaited them inside. When they entered the home, they found blood smeared on the walls and floors, and in the kitchen they found John's head boiling in a pot. The scene inside was beyond anything the officers could have imagined. His skinless body was draped across the lounge. The officers, hardened by years of service, were shaken to their core by the horror they could never unsee. As though in a macabre twist, Catherine Knight had taken sleeping pills after the murder and was found semi-conscious on the bed, as though preparing to end her own life. She was arrested on the spot. During her trial, the details of her crime sent shockwaves through the country. Catherine Knight showed no remorse. Her blank expression deepened the terror that everyone felt as they heard what she had done. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, but that didn't lessen the horror of her actions. Her defense claimed she had no memory of the murder, but the overwhelming evidence was impossible to ignore. The court, disgusted by the brutality of her actions, sentenced Catherine Knight to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She became the first woman in Australian history to receive such a sentence, a fitting punishment for a crime so severe. To this day, Catherine Knight remains behind bars at the Silverwater Women's Correctional Centre, where she will spend the rest of her life. The house where John Price met his grisly end remains abandoned, sealed off, a haunting monument to the darkest side of human nature. The name, Catherine Knight, has since become synonymous with evil in Australia, a woman whose capacity for violence shocked a nation. The mere mention of her crime sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears it. The brutality, the calculated mutilation, and the horrifying aftermath remind us that true horror often lies not in ghost stories, but in the terrifying depths of the human mind. Catherine Knight's crime is a story of unimaginable horror, a true event that has left an indelible scar on Australia's history. The year was 1961, and Sydney, Australia, was a city bustling with life, but beneath the surface, in the dark corners of the city, a nightmare was taking shape. A monster walked the streets. A man who would soon earn the name that would strike fear into the hearts of everyone who heard it. The Sydney Mutilator. It began with the discovery of an elderly man, William MacDonald, found brutally murdered in a public restroom in the heart of Sydney. His body had been mutilated in ways that made seasoned detectives turn pale. His throat had been savagely slashed. But that wasn't all. His genitals had been removed in an act of unspeakable violence. The public was horrified. The police left baffled. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something far more sinister. But the killer, he wasn't done just weeks later. The mutilator struck again. Another elderly man, Amos Hurst, was found in a park. His body displayed the same horrific injuries. His throat cut open, his body desecrated, his genitalia viciously removed. The same method, the same cold brutality. Sydney was gripped by fear. The streets grew empty at night. People too terrified to venture out. The newspapers branded him the Sydney Mutilator. And the city became a hunting ground for this sadistic predator. And yet, despite the rising body count, no one could catch him. He moved silently, without warning, striking down his victims and vanishing into the night. There were no clues, no witnesses, only blood and mutilated bodies left in his wake. The killings became more frequent and more brutal. In the dark alleys and quiet streets, the mutilator's reign of terror continued. Each victim, an elderly man, alone, easy prey for a monster who seemed to revel in the pain and suffering he caused. The mutilator wasn't just killing, he was feeding on fear, thriving on the horror he left behind. He had become the shadow people feared in the night, the faceless specter that could be lurking behind every corner, in every darkened street. One of his next victims was Frank McLean, found murdered in a bathroom near Moore Park. His body was in the same grotesque condition, mutilated, defiled. A cold reminder that the killer had no intention of stopping. But with every murder, the mutilator grew bolder, more confident. He believed he could never be caught. Then, in 1962, the mutilator made a mistake. He killed Patrick Hackett, a drifter with no family and no ties, thinking he could add another name to his growing list of victims without consequence. But this time, there was a witness. A man had seen Hackett and his killer together just hours before the murder for the first time. The police had a lead, and it led them to William MacDonald, the real name of the man behind the mutilations. MacDonald had been hiding in plain sight. A quiet, seemingly ordinary man, he had once been a mental patient, released back into society despite the violent urges he had expressed during his treatment. And now, he had unleashed those urges on the unsuspecting citizens of Sydney. MacDonald was arrested, and when police searched his home, they found the tools of his gruesome trade: knives, gloves, blood-stained clothing. In the courtroom, the true horror of MacDonald's actions came to light. He had murdered at least about 5 men. Though the true number could have been higher, his confession was chilling. He described, in sickening detail, how he lured his victims, how he took pleasure in their suffering. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to destroy, to leave behind something so horrific that it would haunt the city forever. MacDonald showed no remorse. He was cold, detached, as though the lives he had taken meant nothing. The Sydney Mutilator was sentenced to life in prison, but even behind bars, his legacy of terror lived on. The memory of his crimes, the fear he had spread, the bodies he had mutilated, would never be forgotten. Sydney, a city that had once been vibrant and full of life, had been forever marked by his darkness. The places where he had stalked his victims, now haunted by the memory of what had happened there. The mutilator's reign of terror was over, but the scars remained. So if you find yourself walking through the quiet streets of Sydney late at night, take a moment to think about the shadows lurking in the corners, the faces hidden in the dark, because once a man walked those streets, a man with a hunger for blood, a man who reveled in the mutilation of his victims, a man who became more than just a killer. He became a nightmare and nightmares are never truly forgotten. In the small, serene town of Port Arthur, nestled on the rugged Tasman Peninsula in Tasmania, Australia, the morning of April 28, 1996 began like any other. The sun was shining, and the air was filled with the sounds of tourists milling about the historic site, one of Australia's most significant convict settlements. Families wandered through the grounds, children's laughter echoed off the stone walls, and people reflected on the history of this peaceful place. But by the end of that day, people would be dead, more than 20 others would be injured, and the name Martin Bryant would forever be etched in infamy as the perpetrator of one of the deadliest mass shootings the world had ever seen. The Port Arthur Massacre would become a stain on Australia's history, a day when unthinkable violence shattered the tranquility of this quiet town and sent shockwaves through the nation. Martin Bryant, a 28-year-old man with a troubled past, had checked into a bed and breakfast the night before, just another visitor in a town used to seeing strangers pass through. He gave no sign of the horror that was about to unfold. The following morning, he walked casually among the other tourists, wandering the historic grounds like any other guest. But beneath his calm exterior, something far more sinister was brewing. Just after 1 p.m., Bryant entered the Broad Arrow Cafe, a popular spot within the Port Arthur historic site. He carried with him a large bag, hiding a semi-automatic rifle inside. The cafe was bustling, filled with families enjoying a peaceful lunch, completely unaware of the nightmare that was about to descend. Without warning, Bryant pulled out the rifle, and in the blink of an eye he opened fire. The first shots rang out, sharp and sudden, echoing through the cafe like thunder. Chaos erupted as people scrambled to escape, but there was no time. Bryant was calm, emotionless, and methodical. In just a few short minutes, he had killed of people inside the cafe, leaving a scene of unimaginable carnage. Bodies lay sprawled across the floor, blood pooling beneath them, while the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the screams of the wounded. But for Bryant, the horror wasn't over. He walked out of the cafe, reloading his weapon with chilling calm. He moved through the grounds, shooting anyone in his path, tourists, families, children. It didn't matter, he showed no mercy. The sound of gunfire shattered the peaceful afternoon as people fled in terror, desperate to escape the carnage. One of the most chilling aspects of the massacre was Bryant's utter lack of remorse. He showed no emotion, no hesitation. As people ran, he followed, hunting them like prey, coldly taking lives with the efficiency of a predator. He seemed to thrive on the chaos he had created, moving with deliberate cruelty. In the car park, Bryant's killing spree continued. He shot at people trying to escape in their vehicles, leaving them dead or dying as they slumped over the steering wheels. No one was safe. No place was safe. He moved as though he had all the time in the world, stopping to reload his weapon, as though the screams and terror around him were nothing more than background noise. But the horror wasn't confined to the cafe and the grounds. Bryant hijacked a vehicle, killing its occupants before speeding off toward a nearby guest house. There, the violence continued. He took more lives in a terrifying standoff with police that stretched through the night. The hours dragged on, filled with fear and uncertainty, as the small community of Port Arthur reeled from the carnage. It wasn't until the next morning that Bryant was finally captured. By the time the bloodshed was over, 35 people lay dead. Men, women, children, all of them innocent lives cut down in a blink. Another 23 had been wounded. Survivors were left traumatized, haunted by the scenes of horror they had witnessed. The massacre sent shockwaves through Australia. How could something so horrific, so senseless happen in a country where mass shootings were almost unheard of? The Port Arthur Massacre shattered the illusion of safety and left an entire nation in mourning. The scale of the violence, the sheer brutality of it, felt incomprehensible. The days that followed were filled with grief and confusion. The nation struggled to understand how a man like Martin Bryant could commit such an atrocity. His background was troubling. He had a low IQ and a history of behavioral problems, but nothing in his past could fully explain the level of violence he unleashed. To this day, no one knows exactly why Bryant chose that day, that place, and those people to unleash his fury. But out of the ashes of the Port Arthur Massacre came something that would change Australia forever.